Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. We had another great CMO coffee talk this morning. Latney is not here, so you just get me today in terms of our regular co-host, but I'm very excited to be joined by our expert from this morning, Jennifer Fonderve. It was serendipitous, Jennifer, because we'd had a couple people say they were in the midst of M&A activity in the group and say I really would love some advice. Other people said yes. This got voted up as a topic to cover, and I think at the exact same day, you were introduced to me as someone that could be a good sort of expert in the session. So it all worked out great, and we just had a ton of interest, a ton of comments, and you shared a lot this morning. So first of all, thank you for doing all of that. And I wanted to here quickly just highlight a few of the themes that you covered, because you also have a 2-page worksheet and checklist that you shared. You've got a chapter from your book. You've got your Harvard Business Review article. We've got all of those up on the Slack channel that we'll put up on the Content Hub as well. Yeah. So tons of stuff people can go to dig in on with you. But I mean, first, the same question I asked you a couple times this morning. This is a very narrow niche in terms of marketing consulting. How did you get here?
So what I loved most about our session, Matt, is I'm a recovering chief marketing officer. I was with my tribe, and because I'd gone through 3 multi-billion-dollar acquisitions and I had been on all sides of the equation, I got into this because by the third one, I just thought there's got to be a better way to do M&A, a way in which people don't lose sight of their value.
Yeah, and what was interesting this morning is we oftentimes have people sharing best practices, and lots of people take notes. Say, I'm going to do this moving forward. It was, in your words, a little cathartic this morning as well, from people kind of sharing experiences with each other and realizing that, boy, M&A can be a real mess if you aren't thinking about this stuff in advance. And to your point on LinkedIn earlier this week, what people think of as unexpected problems are pretty common and should be expected. And it all comes down to one element. What's the primary thing that sort of leads to some of those challenges?
Well, it's kind of what I laughed about. I shouldn't say laugh. What surprised me when I was interviewing executives for my book, the fact that they would say the failure that they hadn't anticipated was unexpected people problems. And I said, well, they should be expected. And yet you can minimize and mitigate some of that if you actually plan for it and plan around it. And so what I love from our conversation this morning was the energy of marketers in the discussion talking about, yes, marketing needs to have a seat at the table, that a lot of the issues that we had all seen, because I was actually surprised how many people, how many of the marketers were going through or had been through and experienced multiple, and all agreed marketing not having a seat at the table has led to a lot of those issues because it's just not thought of. It's M&A is such a transactionally driven decision that the people part is typically a secondary thought.
Well, let's go a little deeper on that. I think you're going to be really busy from people that are going to call you afterward and sort of want to get your book, and we'll put your contact information. I'll have you share that here at the end. But relative to sort of that pre-M&A activity, too often, to your point, marketers don't know about this. Even marketing leaders, even the CMO, oftentimes is out of the loop until the very end. And then all of a sudden, you've got this crazy emergency cycle to get a press release together. But there's an awful lot that marketers can help with and that marketing leaders can help with well before those deals are consummated, let alone as they're considered. What are some of those key pieces that marketing leaders can provide value in before the deal happens?
Well, first I should highlight, because I loved in the chat, we talked about what are the signs that potentially your company is pursuing, right? So you aren't blindsided. And I talked about the fact that, succession planning isn't clear. You've seen revenue declines over several quarters. You've got gaps in your product or talent. Digital transformation is needed. But what I loved was some of the other pieces of advice were, a lot of people in the past being in conference rooms, your CEO suddenly asking you for market studies, or people's resumes. Like, there are a lot of cues that you may be considering a merger and acquisition. And one of the key things that we talked about is you've got to be smart as a marketer. Watch what's happening in the marketplace. Look what's happening in your particular business segment. Are competitors acting differently? Have they acquired or been acquired? Use those cues to get smart so that you can have that insight and insert yourself in the conversation. I think the other piece that we talked about a lot is don't wait to be asked. Act as though you already have a right to be at that table.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there was a lot of insight, and your checklist has a lot of things that sort of are important to think about in advance that many companies don't think about. Like if your M&A is being led by someone in finance or sort of, someone on the operations side, they're not thinking necessarily about emotions of people that are being acquired. They're not thinking about sort of clarity of roles for the people that are both acquired as well as those doing the acquiring to make sure that that is figured out. The hidden costs of acquisitions. I mean, little things like all of a sudden we got to buy a lot more Salesforce licenses. And if you don't think about that up front, that could be a real painful thing. Talk a little bit about the people side of this. Like it was very, I thought it was very smart of you to put the 5 stages of grief explicitly into your sort of checklist. You really have to think about feelings and emotions and sort of work people through that to make sure that these M&A events are successful. And the marketing team can play a big role on that across both teams.
Right. And to your point, right, once marketing has a seat at the table, tie everything to revenue, right? The impact that this is going to have on, whether it's licensing agreements that you have. Someone brought up Salesforce, right? Trade show, or you both companies have a booth at the trade show, the cost of that. So once you have a seat at the table, it's not an emotional thing that you're leaning in on, but the revenue impact of not thinking through these things. But then on the emotional side, as you highlighted, marketing has an opportunity to highlight that your company is going to grieve, whether you are acquirer or acquiree. Both companies couldn't go it alone. This deal happened for a reason. And I really loved the discussion around that and how many people sparked to the fact, once you highlighted that in my book, I talk about the stages of grief. I could almost see, people hitting their palms on their forehead going, yeah, that's what it felt like. Because you do grieve. You're grieving the company that no longer exists because it's changed overnight. And so what was important for me in the book that I wrote was to highlight it's an emotional journey. Yeah. And that's minimized. So much of business, as you know, is transactional, it's logical, it's linear. But post M&A, it is a non-linear path. And so I wanted to highlight with the stages of grief, the people aren't going crazy. You're in mourning. You're mourning the future that won't be.
Well, in some cases, even if you're the company doing the acquiring and you're adding to people's team, I mean, people mourn the loss of normalcy. They mourn the loss of what they were comfortable with. And so it's, you can't underestimate the impact that's going to have. Last question for you, because I know you got to run, is, around this concept of the integration circus. And I just think that is, anyone who's been through this, it is such a good metaphor. And one of my favorite quotes from you this morning, it says, like, every integration involves integration circuses. You just need fewer clowns, right? Right. Smaller circuses, fewer clowns. Talk a little bit, how do you do that? Like, how do you create more efficiency as those teams start to figure out how to work together?
Well, I think one, and this is why marketing being at the table, it's clarity of roles. Too often what happens is the people piece isn't considered. So that game plan aspect isn't considered. And suddenly the deal's announced, marketing finds out, and people aren't clear on what their roles are. Yeah. Beyond that, it's lack of clarity on the vision. Why did this deal happen? What is the vision? What are we working towards? When that's cloudy or murky, your employees have a very difficult time seeing what their role is, how they can contribute to that vision. So both on defining the roles clearly, but the vision, marketing has a huge role to play in guiding that aspect of it.
Awesome. All right. So you were generous enough to give us some great information. We have it up on, all that information is up on the Slack channel already, including your 9-hour, 95 playlist.
Yeah.
If you do nothing else, like, go get this. She has found some of the best emotionally assuring, also just great metaphorical songs about going through this process. So awesome. Jennifer, how can people get a hold of you if they want to learn more about you and some of your ideas?
Couple of ways. Obviously through my website, which is jenniferjfondreve.com, but also on my through email. So which that is, and I think it's probably somewhere in your notes, Jennifer@jenniferjfondreve.com.
Awesome. Well, you've been really generous today, joining both of our sessions as well as doing this. Thank you so much for being part of this. If you're listening to this and you missed this morning's sessions, definitely check out the Slack channel to find what you're missing. If you're wondering what the heck all this is about, and you are a marketing leader, if you're a VP or C-level marketing leader and you want to spend time with a few hundred of your peers on a weekly basis and on a day-to-day basis on Slack as well, we'd love to have you join the CMO Coffee Talk. Feel free to send me a message or DM me, and we'll get you information about that. In the coming weeks, just to finish out the year, we've got some really amazing sessions coming up. Next week, we're going to be covering partner and channel marketing, partner and channel go-to-market strategies, different than direct in a lot of ways that sometimes are surprising. So we've got some folks to come talk about that. After Thanksgiving, we've got a session around product-led growth and the keys to doing that well. We've got a session around how marketing leaders can lead strategic planning in their organizations, including sort of managing offsites, including virtual offsites. So we're going to have to do now. So lots of good stuff coming up in the CMO Coffee Talk community. Make sure you're not missing out on it. But for today, Jennifer, thanks so much for doing this. We'll see y'all next week.
So glad we had a chance to talk about it. It's an important topic, so I was thrilled to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you again. Everyone have a good weekend. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.